Hello everyone, welcome to Milo e-learning. So today we're going to be discussing history grade 7. The colonization of the Cape in the 17th century is a topic for history in grade 7 for term 3. Now this video is going to focus on the indigenous inhabitants. Now indigenous inhabitants basically were the first people that lived at the Cape. But before I move on to that, I will give you a quick overview of the whole syllabus for term 3. So we're going to talk about the first inhabitants, which were the indigenous people at the Cape. Then we're going to talk about Dutch settlement, which are the European people that came from that made up the Dutch East India Company. So we're going to talk about how they arrived, why they arrived, who they came with, why they brought slaves. We'll discuss how slavery developed and how the slaves felt. Then we're going to talk about the slave resistance, the causes and the effects of that, and how Islam spread and the development of the African language. Then we'll discuss the Freeburgers, the Dutch, the French Huguenots, and how they explored into the interior. We'll talk about the movement of the Trekboers and their lifestyles, and land disposition and the consequences of the indigenous population, specifically the Jenadale, and the first mission station established in southern Africa. And we'll conclude by the work of William Blake and Lucy Lloyd. So to start with the indigenous inhabitants, they were basically the San and the Khoikhoi. So you can see this is a picture of the Cape Colony. Now where the Atlantic Ocean and the Indian Ocean met is where the Cape of Good Hope was established. Now remember in grade 6 you learned about European explorations. So the Europeans came through a gale force and accidentally landed at the Cape. So you learned about the first attack and clash between the Khoikhoi and the European farmers were caused because Europeans drank water from the stream and they didn't ask permission from the Khoikhoi at that time, and that was the first cross-border attack, and that's how it started. Now when the Europeans established themselves at the Cape of Good Hope, then they explored to go to India to trade their spices, and monsoon winds carried them along the Indian Ocean to go to India. So what we're going to talk about in this topic is basically the establishment of the Europeans and the Dutch in the Cape Colony and how the Cape Colony was established. So the first inhabitants was basically the San and the Khoikhoi. The San were hunter-gatherers and the Khoikhoi were herders and pastoralists. Now the San basically meant people that were different from ourselves. So they were hunter-gatherers, and the food that they used to eat was basically from wild animals. They hunted wild animals and they gathered plants, and they ate planted foods that were fruit, nuts, berries, mushrooms, roots, and bulbs. Now, the San people were nomadic, and they moved from place to place depending on the seasons of the food that were available at the different times of the year. Then we know that the San people basically used to engrave paintings on rocks and all over southern Africa, and this is how the archaeologists established the history of the San people that lived there many thousands of years ago. Now, the Dutch basically came in the 17th century and they displaced the San from living in this area as well. But not only did the Dutch displace the San, the Khoikhoi were in conflict with the San as well, because the Khoikhoi also lived in this area and they came in from the north, the Khoikhoi. The Khoikhoi basically is a word that means men among men, and they were very similar in appearance to the San, except that they were taller. Now the Khoikhoi came from North Africa as well. So they were pastoralists and they lived along the coastal regions of the Cape, and their status was measured in sheep and cattle. So it was the amount of sheep and cattle that they owned. Now, they lived around water, animals, and land, and they made tools and weapons and ornaments from copper and iron. And this was obtained from trading with the Africans in the north. So the Strandloppers were basically a part of the Khoikhoi family, and they lived along the beaches and in caves, and they lived off fish and shellfish. So the San and the Khoikhoi were basically in conflict with each other over cattle and also land. Now, the pictures of the drawings of the sand was basically on your top left. In the center, you must know that the Sand people were used to worship their ancestors, and they used to take part in trance dances. And this is the middle picture that shows you these trance dances. Now on the right hand side, you'll see on the top, you'll see a picture of the Khoikhoi. Now the other people that lived in the Cape, which is, if you look at the map, it is the eastern part of the Cape, were the Xhosa. So these Xhosa people, this is a picture of the women smoking their pipes. Now, these Xhosa people were basically the first African farmers that settled in the Cape. So they settled along the eastern Cape, which is known as Transkei and Ciskei today. Now, these African farmers planted sorghum and millet, and the reason why they chose sorghum and millet to plant here is because the region was suitable to plant these types of crop. In the summer, they received about 500 millimeters of rain, and this allowed these crops to grow. Now, they loved drinking sour milk and sorghum beer, and millet was one of their staple grains that they used to uh, eat. It was highly nutritious, it was tasty, and it was easy to digest. Now, the African farmers owned large herds of cattle, and it was a form of their wealth as well. So, the more cattle you earned, it meant the richer you were. Now, the European farmers came into this region through that gale force winds, and they clashed with the Khoikhoi and the Sand people that were living in this area. Then, once the farmers settled in the eastern part, they chose an area to live near the river because living near a river, the land there is basically quite fertile, and they planted their crops, and they did not settle in the high veld because it was too cold there, nor did they settle in the Kalahari Desert because it was too dry, and the Drakensberg was basically too cold and it was hilly, so they couldn't plant crops. Now, you need to know this information because in tests and in exams and in exercises, I can give you maps and I can ask you identify the areas where the Xhosa people lived and explain why they lived in these regions and why did they not choose to live in other regions, right? So it's important to know specifically why they chose to live in certain areas. Now, the farmers built basically strong houses in towards the east of Drakensberg, and they made a permanent establishment there, and their houses were basically made out of wood, reeds, and grass. So we're going to move on to the arrival of the Dutch. Now, the Dutch came with their ships, and this caused conflict between them and the San and Xhosa and Khoikhoi people. So they arrived at the Cape in 1652. Now, they traded with ships traveling in the east, and they stopped here at the Cape for a rest and to find food and water. They settled here as a Dutch colony, and they brought slaves with them to do the work. Because they were in conflict with the San and the Dutch and the Khoikhoi and Xhosa people, the African farmers did not want to work for the Dutch people, so the Dutch people brought slaves with them. So they expanded their colony, and this basically changed the way the life of the Khoikhoi and the Sand people. The grazing lands of the indigenous people were taken over by the settlers in the 18th century, and the Trekboers and the Dutch people moved further inland as they wanted to establish their colony in further. Now, you must know the Trekboers drove the San away from their hunting grounds, and they captured their San women and children and used them as slaves. So my next video would be more on the Dutch settlement. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Hope you enjoyed my video. Bye everyone. Have a lovely day.